Fleet Commander Thyserek stood at the center of his command bridge and watched 1,200 warships glide through the darkness of deep space like a river of silver and light. The fourth Grand Armada of the Galactic Concordance stretched across 400 kilometers of void, each vessel shining with the pale blue glow of graviton engines and the soft shimmer of layered energy shields that bent starlight around their hulls like halos. It was, by any measure, the most beautiful and terrifying military force the galaxy had ever assembled. Thyserek allowed himself a moment of satisfaction as his bioluminescent crest shifted from its resting amber to a deep, proud gold that rippled along the ridge of his skull and down his neck like liquid metal catching firelight. He had earned this command through 3 campaigns and 40 years of service to the Concordance. And in all that time, he had never once tasted defeat. Today would not be the day that— "Sub-Commander Lithara," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried across the bridge without effort. "Status of the fleet." Lithara stepped forward from her station, her own crest a muted teal that betrayed the careful control she always maintained over her emotions. She was younger than most officers at her rank, sharp-minded and cautious in a way that Thyserek sometimes found useful and sometimes found irritating. "All vessels report ready, Commander," she said. "Formation integrity is holding at optimal, and we are on schedule to reach the Rim colonies within 6 standard cycles." Thyserek nodded once and turned back to the viewport. The Rim colonies, a scattered collection of frontier worlds at the far edge of mapped space, home to dozens of minor species who had refused to pay tribute to the Concordance and had somehow convinced themselves that distance alone would protect them from the consequences of that refusal. Wrong. The Concordance had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years, not through cruelty, but through an absolute and unshakable certainty that order required hierarchy and hierarchy required obedience. Species that submitted were welcomed into the fold, given access to trade networks and technology and the protection of the greatest military force in existence. Species that refused were brought to heel. It was not personal, Thyserek told himself as he watched the stars drift past. It was simply the way the universe worked. "Commander," Lithara said from behind him, and something in her voice made his crest flicker with a trace of orange, the color of mild annoyance. "What is it?" "I have been reviewing the intelligence briefings on the Rim corridor, and there is a notation I believe warrants your attention." Thyserek did not turn around. "Go on." "A relatively new species has established settlements among the Rim colonies within the last 30 standard years. They call themselves humans, and they originate from a small rocky world in an unremarkable system on the very edge of the spiral arm. Classification: Class 7 Pre-Ascendant," Lithara said, and Thyserek's crest settled back to gold as the tension left his shoulders. Class 7 was barely above animal intelligence in the Concordance ranking system. It meant the species had achieved basic spaceflight, but lacked the fundamental technologies that defined a true interstellar civilization. No energy shields, no plasma weaponry, no graviton manipulation, no faster-than-light communication arrays. In short, nothing worth worrying about. Their ships reportedly operate on controlled nuclear reactions and chemical-based propulsion systems, Lithara continued, and even she could not keep a faint note of disbelief from her voice. Thyserek actually laughed, a short bark of genuine amusement that made several bridge officers glance up from their stations. "Nuclear reactions," he repeated. "They burn atoms and ride the fire like savages, warming themselves at a campfire, while we command the forces of gravity itself." "Yes, Commander. However, there is one detail that I find somewhat unusual." "And what detail is that?" Lithara hesitated for just a moment, and Thyserek noticed that her crest had shifted to a pale, uncertain blue. "Over the past 8 cycles, the Concordance has dispatched 14 scout vessels into the region of space adjacent to human-controlled territory, Standard reconnaissance protocol ahead of our advance. And none of them have reported back. None, Commander. They were not destroyed, as far as we can determine. There were no distress signals, and no debris fields detected on long-range scans. They simply went silent. A silence settled over the bridge. Thisarek studied Lithara's face for a long moment, then let out a slow breath and turned back to the viewport. Scout vessels malfunction, he said. Sensors fail, and communications break down at the edge of mapped space, where relay networks are thin and unreliable. 14 ships is unusual, but not unprecedented, and certainly not cause to delay an operation of this scale. Of course, Commander, Lithara said, but her crest remained that pale, uncertain blue, and she did not move from her position. You disagree? Thisarek said, not a question. I am cautious by nature, Commander. You have told me so yourself on many occasions. I have, and I have also told you that caution is a virtue only when it serves action, not when it replaces it. Lithara lowered her head in acknowledgement and stepped back to her station. Thisarek returned his gaze to the stars and the vast glittering column of warships that surrounded his flagship like a constellation. Motion. 1,200 vessels, each one a masterwork of concordance engineering. Each one armed with plasma lance batteries, capable of overloading any known shield system in the galaxy. Each one crewed by officers who had trained for decades in the art of precision warfare. Against a scattered collection of minor species and a handful of primitives who still burned atoms for fuel. It was not even a contest. He reached for the fleet-wide communication channel and opened it with a gesture, his voice carrying to every ship in the formation. All vessels, this is Fleet Commander Thisarek. War entering the Rim Corridor. Maintain formation and proceed at standard advance speed. We will arrive at the first colony world within 6 cycles, and this campaign will be concluded before the turn of the quarter. He paused and let his crest blaze a brilliant, commanding gold. The Concordance brings order. We are its instrument. Let nothing stand before. Across 1,200 bridges, officers acknowledged the command, and the armada surged forward as one, a tide of light and power flowing into the darkness of unclaimed space. Behind Thisarek, Lithara watched the tactical display at her station and said nothing. But her crest had shifted again, from uncertain blue to something darker, a shade that the Valorian emotional spectrum did not have a convenient name for, but that a human might have recognized immediately. It was the color of a bad feeling. The armada dropped out of hyperstream at the outer boundary of the Helix Nebula, and the darkness that greeted them was absolute. This was normal. The Helix Nebula was a dead place, a vast graveyard of ancient stars that had burned themselves out long before the first Valorian had ever looked up at the sky and wondered what the lights were. It was also the last waypoint before the Rim colonies, which made it the perfect place to regroup and prepare for the final push into enemy territory. Across the formation, 1,200 warships shed the shimmering blue cocoons of their hyperstream drives and settled into real space with the practiced grace of a fleet that had done this 1,000 times before. On the bridge of the flagship Ascendant Will, Sensor Officer Kelvan ran his fingers across the detection console and began the standard sweep. Kelvan was not a warrior. He was a technician, a reader of signals and patterns, a quiet and methodical soul, who found comfort in the clean predictability of data, and who had never once in his career wished to be anything other than exactly what he was. His job was to look into the darkness and tell his commander what was there. And right now, the darkness was telling him something strange. Sub-Commander Lithara, he said, keeping his voice level, even as his crest flickered with the pale green of confusion. I am reading a gravitational anomaly at extreme detection range, bearing 772 by 315. Lithara was at his side in moments. Define anomaly. A mass signature, significant in size, but completely passive. No energy emissions, no electromagnetic radiation, no thermal signature, nothing. It is simply sitting there. An asteroid? Possible, Kelvon said, but his crest flickered again. The mass distribution is unusual for a natural object, however. It is too uniform, too dense. Glanced toward the central platform, where Thisaric stood in conversation with his fleet captains. Flag it for monitoring and continue the sweep, she said. We will revisit it if the profile changes. Kelvon nodded and returned to his work. The sweep continued, the fleet regrouped, and the anomaly sat in the darkness and did nothing at all. One full cycle passed. The armada began its advance toward the rim colonies, and the anomaly remained exactly where it was, motionless and silent at the edge of their sensor range, like a stone at the bottom of a river. It was Kelvon who finally brought it to Thisaric's attention directly. After his third attempt at a focus scan, returned results that made his scales itch with unease. Commander, he said, the anomaly is absorbing our sensor pulses. Thisaric paused mid-sentence and turned to look at the sensor officer with the slow, dangerous focus of a predator whose attention had been captivated. Caught. Explain, our active scans are not reflecting off the object, Commander. They are being absorbed. Something on or around the object is swallowing our detection pulses entirely. I cannot get a clear resolution at this range. A stealth field? No, Commander. Stealth fields bend sensor energy around the object, and we would detect the distortion. This is different. Whatever that object is, it is simply eating our scans and giving nothing back. Thisaric's crest shifted to a hard, flat orange. Send a destroyer squadron, he said. 12 ships, close to visual range, and identify. The 12 destroyers broke from the main formation and accelerated toward the anomaly in a tight wedge pattern, their plasma lances powered and ready. Kelvon watched them go on his display, 12 bright points of light streaking toward a patch of darkness that his instruments insisted was both there and not there at the same time. Past. The destroyers closed the distance. 50,000 kilometers, 40,000, 30,000. At 20,000 kilometers, the lead destroyer's short-range sensors finally cut through the interference and resolved the shape of the object. The data came back to the Ascendant Will in a burst transmission, and when Kelvon processed it and put the image on the main display, his voice cracked in a way that he would be embarrassed about for the rest of his life. Commander, he said, and every head on the bridge turned toward the screen. It was a ship. One single solitary ship. But the word ship felt obscene in the face of what they were looking at. The thing was nearly 4 kilometers long, a brutal slab of dark metal that looked like it had been forged in a furnace and dragged through a war before anyone had bothered to attach engines to it. There were no elegant curves, no sweeping lines, no decorative insignia or aesthetic flourishes of any kind. It was angular and blunt and ugly in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as if whoever had built it had actively despised the concept of beauty and had decided to make something that communicated only one single idea: violence. The hull was not smooth. It was layered, thick plates of dark metal stacked and welded and bolted over one another, like the scales of some ancient armored beast, scarred and pitted and scorched with the evidence of impacts that should have destroyed any vessel the Concordance had ever built. And embedded in that hull, running in rows and clusters along every surface, were hundreds of cylindrical protrusions that none of the Valorian sensor officers could identify. They were not plasma lance emitters. They were not shield generators. They were not communication arrays. They were something else entirely. The bridge of the Ascendant Will had gone completely silent. Thisaric stared at the image. Said nothing, his crest cycling through colors so rapidly that it was almost strobing. Lithara stepped forward, her own crest a shade of white that Kelvon had never seen on a living Valorian before. "What species builds like this?" she whispered, and her voice carried across the silent bridge like a prayer spoken in a tomb. No one answered her. because the truth was that no species in the known galaxy built like this. The Concordance built ships that were graceful and luminous, and designed to project power through beauty as much as through force. The Kreth built sleek predatory vessels that mimicked the aquatic hunters of their homeworld. Even the crude warships of the Brakari were decorated with clan markings and ceremonial armor that spoke to a warrior culture with a sense of pride and identity. This thing had no identity. It had no pride, no grace, no beauty, no culture on display. It was a machine built for one purpose, and one purpose only, and it did not care if you understood that purpose or not. Then the ship's transponder activated. A single ping, broadcast on the universal communication frequency in crude galactic common. One word: Terra. Kelvon felt his blood go cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. He looked at Lithara, and she looked back at him, and in that shared glance, he saw something he had never expected to see in the eyes of a Valorian officer: fear. Behind them, Fisarek's crest had finally settled on a single color. It was pale, almost white. And for the first time in 40 years of service, Fleet Commander Thisarek did not immediately know what to do next. Thisarek recovered faster than most would have. He was a commander, and commanders did not freeze, did not falter, did not stand gaping at a screen like a hatchling seeing the sky for the first time. He straightened his spine, forced his crest back to a steady, authoritative orange, and spoke in a voice that betrayed nothing. "Open a communication channel to that vessel," he said. "Standard subjugation frequency, full concordance authority codes." The communications officer obeyed, and the bridge waited in a silence so thick that Quelvon could hear the hum of the flagship's graviton core 3 decks below. The channel opened, static at first, then a brief crackle of interference, and then a face appeared on the main display. It was an alien face, soft and pale, and framed by dark hair pulled back tight against the skull, with 2 forward-facing eyes that sat beneath a smooth brow ridge, and a mouth that was currently set in a flat, neutral line. A human face. The human was sitting in a chair, at the center of a bridge that looked nothing like any command deck Thisarek had ever seen. There was no gold, no ambient lighting, no holographic displays floating in elegant arcs around the commander's seat. Instead, there were hard surfaces and flat screens, an exposed conduit running along the ceiling, and everything was painted in the same dull gray as the ship's exterior. It looked like the inside of a machine, not the inside of a warship. The human looked at the screen, and at the face of Fleet Commander Thisarek, and her expression did not change at all. "This is Captain Elena Vasquez of the Terran Federal ship Erebus," she said, and her voice was calm and even, and carried the same flat energy as someone reporting the weather. "You are broadcasting on a concordance military frequency in neutral space. Please identify yourself and state your intentions." Thisarek felt a muscle in his jaw tighten. He had delivered the subjugation address hundreds of times, and it had always been received with fear or anger or desperate negotiation. He had never received a response that sounded like a bored customs official asking for paperwork. "I am Fleet Commander Thisarek of the Galactic Concordance 4th Grand Armada," he said, letting his voice carry the full weight of his authority. "You are in the path of a sanctioned military operation. You will stand down, submit to inspection, and surrender sovereignty of this vessel to the Concordance immediately." The human captain looked at him for a moment, and then did something that made Lithara's crest go white again. She raised one eyebrow, just slightly, just enough to be noticeable, and in that tiny movement was something that Thisarek could not quite name, but that felt uncomfortably close to amusement. "Commander Thisarek," Vasquez said, "the Erebus is currently on a defensive patrol of Allied Rim Colony space under the terms of a mutual protection agreement ratified by the Terran Federal Senate. I am not authorized to stand down, submit to inspection, or surrender this vessel." She paused, and then added in the same calm tone. I would recommend that your fleet reverse course. This is not a threat. It is a professional recommendation. Fitzeric cut the channel. His crest was blazing orange now, true anger, and he turned to his tactical staff with eyes that could have cut steel. I want a full technical analysis of that ship in my hands, within the quarter cycle, he said. Every weapon system, every structural weakness, every vulnerability. Find me the places where it breaks. The tactical team went to work. They pulled the scan data from the destroyer squadron and fed it through every analytical system the Ascendant Will possessed. And they cross-referenced it with every known weapons technology in the Concordance database. Report came back in 12 minutes. Lithara read it first, and when she brought it to Fitzeric, her hands were not quite steady. The cylindrical protrusions along the hull are weapons, Commander, she said, but they are not energy weapons of any kind we have on record. Then what are they? Mass drivers, Lithara said, and kinetic bombardment cannons. They are designed to accelerate physical projectiles, solid pieces of metal, to a significant fraction of the speed of light. Fitzeric stared at her. They throw rocks? They throw rocks at 30% of light speed, Commander. A single tungsten projectile of the size our scans suggest, traveling at that velocity, would carry enough kinetic energy to tear through one of our heavy cruisers from bow to stern and exit the other side. The bridge went quiet again. Lithara continued, her voice steady even though her crest had gone the color of old bone. The ship also carries what appear to be missile systems. Thousands of individual warheads housed in internal launch bays. Our analysis indicates that many of these warheads are nuclear-tipped. Nuclear, Fitzeric repeated, and the word tasted like ash. Yes, Commander, fusion-based warheads with yields that our systems classify as strategic grade. And their defenses? They do not have energy shields, Commander. They have armor, physical armor, layered plates of a tungsten carbide composite alloy that our scans estimate at between 8 and 12 meters thick in places. She took a breath. Our plasma lances are designed to overload energy shield matrices. They work by flooding the target's shield generators with more energy than they can dissipate. But that ship does not have shield generators. It has 12 meters of solid metal between its crew and the void. Are you telling me, Fitzeric said very slowly, that our primary weapons would be ineffective? Telling you that our plasma lances would hit that hull and splash across its surface like water on stone. The energy would dissipate across the armor plating, and the ship would barely register the impact. Our weapons were never designed to fight something like this, because no one in the history of the Concordance has ever built something like this. Fitzeric turned back to the main display, where the image of the human ship still hung in the darkness, a brutal, ugly slab of scarred metal that suddenly looked less like a primitive curiosity and more like a predator that had been sitting in the tall grass, watching them the entire time. Their reactor, he said. What powers that thing? A fusion reactor, Commander, running at temperatures and pressures that our engineering corps has classified as, and I quote, suicidally unstable by Concordance safety standards. But functional. Extremely functional. It gives them an enormous amount of raw power, enough to run those mass drivers continuously, enough to launch missile salvos in rapid succession, enough to maneuver that 4-kilometer hull with a speed and agility that a ship of that size should not possess. Fitzeric closed his eyes. When he opened them, the anger had gone from his crest, and what remained was something harder and colder and far more dangerous. They do not fight like us, he said quietly. No, Commander, Lithara said. They do not fight with precision or elegance. They fight with mass and force and overwhelming physical violence. Their weapons do not disable, they destroy. Their armor does not deflect, it endures. Everything about that ship is built around a single philosophy. Which is? Lithara looked at the screen, and at the scarred and battered hull of the Erebus, and said the words that would haunt the Valorian military establishment for generations. Hit harder than anything can survive, and survive anything that hits. U.P. Scissorak said nothing for a very long time. Then, the communications console chirped, and Captain Vasquez's face appeared on screen again, uninvited this time, and she looked exactly as calm as she had before. "Commander Scissorak," she said, "I notice your destroyer squadron is still holding position near my ship. I want to be transparent with you because I believe honesty prevents misunderstanding." She paused. "You have been scanning the Erebus, and I am sure your people are very good at their jobs, so by now you know what this ship can do. But I want to make sure you have the complete picture." "What do you mean?" Scissorak said. Vasquez looked directly into the screen, and for the first time her expression changed, not to anger or fear or aggression, but to something that might have been pity. "Who said I was alone?" she said. Across the Armada's sensor network, Kelvon's console erupted with alerts as 11 more gravitational measures, anomalies began resolving out of the darkness. 11 more shapes, 11 more ships, each one as massive and brutal and terrifying as the first. Kelvon's crest went solid white and stayed there. On the main display, Captain Vasquez's face remained perfectly calm, and somewhere in the back of his mind, Scissorak heard a sound that he would later realize was the foundation of everything he had ever believed beginning to crack. The 12 ships emerged from the dark like teeth rising from a black jaw. They came in slow, unhurried, shedding their silent running profiles one at a time, as if each one wanted to make sure the Armada had a chance to see it clearly before the next one appeared. Each ship was built in the same brutal style as the Erebus. Dark, angular hulls, layered with thick, scarred armor, and lined with the cylindrical mouths of mass drivers and kinetic cannons. Some were smaller, perhaps 2 kilometers in length, and others were larger. And one of them, the one that emerged last and settled into the center of the formation like a king taking a throne, was nearly 5 kilometers from bow to stern. That ship broadcast its transponder signal, and the name that appeared on every Valorian screen in the fleet was TFS Leviathan. On the bridge of the Ascendant Will, no one spoke. The tactical display showed the 12 human ships arranged in a formation that the Armada's computers could not classify, and this failure was somehow more disturbing than the ships themselves. The Concordance had spent 10,000 years cataloging every known military formation used by every known species, from the tight defensive spheres of the Kreth to the spreading net patterns of the Brakari raiders. The human formation matched nothing in the database. It was not defensive and it was not offensive. It was something else. Something that the Valorian tactical doctrine had no word for because no one had ever needed one. The word, had they known it, was ready. A new communication channel opened, and a new face appeared on the main display. This human was older than Vasquez, a male with dark skin and close-cropped gray hair, and eyes that held the kind of quiet, steady calm that only came from a lifetime of making decisions that other people would have to live or die by. "Fleet Commander Scissorak," the man said, and his voice was warm and unhurried, like someone greeting a neighbor across a fence. "I am Admiral James Okafor, commanding officer of the Terran Federal Navy 7th Patrol Group. I apologize for the dramatic entrance, but I wanted to make sure we had your full attention before we spoke." Scissorak looked at this human and tried to find some trace of fear or bravado or desperation in his face, and found nothing but patient, genuine calm. "You have it," Scissorak said. "Good," Okafor said. "Then let me be direct. The Rim colonies are under the protection of the Terran Federation. This protection was requested by the colonies themselves and was granted freely. We are not here to start a war, Commander. We are here to prevent one." "You are 12 ships," Scissorak said, and he meant it to sound dismissive, but it came out flat. "We are," Okafor agreed, and something in the way he said it made Fisarek's crest shift to a color he could not control. While the two commanders spoke, Lithara had pulled every available piece of intelligence on humans that the Concordance had ever collected, and she had supplemented it with the data from their own scans. She was reading through it all with the focused intensity of someone who has realized that the exam she is taking is not the one she studied for. What she found did not comfort her. Humans had not always been a spacefaring species. They had spent the vast majority of their existence confined to a single world. A small blue planet with a thin atmosphere and a magnetic field that barely kept the radiation of their own star from cooking them alive. And on that small, fragile world, they had spent thousands upon thousands of years doing one thing with extraordinary dedication and creativity: fighting each other. The records were staggering in their scope. War after war after war, stretching back to the very dawn of their civilization. Conflicts fought with sticks and stones, and then with metal, blades, and then with chemical explosives, and then with weapons that could split the atom itself and render entire cities into ash and shadow in a single blinding flash. They had actually used those weapons on each other. Lithara read that line twice to make sure she had not misunderstood. They had built weapons capable of ending their entire species, and they had used them, not once but twice. And then instead of recoiling in horror, they had built more of them, thousands more, and had pointed them at each other across their little world, and had lived like that for generations, each side promising the other that any attack would be met with total annihilation. They called this strategy mutually assured destruction, and they had considered it a form of peace. Lithara set the datapad down and stared at nothing for a moment. She understood now. She understood why human ships looked the way they did, why they were armored instead of shielded, why they used kinetic weapons instead of energy lances, why everything about their military technology was built around the twin pillars of endurance and overwhelming force. They had not developed along the same path as the Concordance, because they had never had the luxury of fighting enemies who played by the same rules. Their enemies had been themselves, and against an enemy that thinks exactly like you do, the only winning strategy is to be tougher, harder, more stubborn, and more willing to absorb punishment than the other side. Concordance warfare was a chess match, elegant and precise, and built on the assumption that both players understood the rules. Human warfare was a fistfight in a burning building, where the winner was whoever was still standing when the roof came down. Lithara brought her findings to Fisarek during a pause in his conversation with Okafor, and she watched his crest drain of color as he read. "Run the battle simulations," he said, quietly. The tactical team ran them. They ran every scenario they could think of, every combination of approach angles and fleet formations and weapons configurations. And they fed the results to Fisarek in a summary document that was barely 2 pages long, because the conclusions were brutally simple. In the best-case scenario, the Armada would win the engagement. It would cost them over 800 ships, against 12. The kinetic weapons would be devastating. The simulations showed tungsten slugs punching through Valorian cruisers like needles through silk. The energy shields designed to dissipate plasma fire, offering almost no resistance to a physical projectile moving at a third of light speed. The nuclear missiles would be worse. Vast expanding spheres of fusion fire that would engulf entire squadrons, and overwhelm shield generators through sheer thermal output. And the human ships themselves would be nightmarishly difficult to kill, their thick physical armor shrugging off plasma lance fire, while their reactors kept feeding power to weapons that never stopped firing. In the worst-case scenario, the one where the humans went on the offensive, the losses climbed past 1,000 ships. Fisarek stared at the numbers. 800 ships in the best case, 1,000 in the worst, against 12 opponents who had not fired a single shot, who had not made a single threat, who were simply sitting in the darkness, in their scarred and ugly ships, and waiting to see what he would do. He looked up at the main display, where Admiral Okafor's face still waited with that patient, steady calm. "Commander," Lithara said softly, standing beside him where no one else could hear. "I have read their history, all of it, every war they have ever fought on their world, and every conflict they have had since they left it. And they have been fighting wars longer than we have had spaceflight." Said, "They fought them against each other, against opponents who thought exactly like they did, who used every trick they could imagine, because the other side would do the same." She paused. "They are very, very good at this." Thisarek said nothing. On the display, Okafor waited. And in the void between the two fleets, the 12 human warships hung motionless and silent, their dark hulls reflecting nothing, their weapons cold but ready, their crews calm and professional, and entirely prepared to fight 1,200 ships to the death, if that was what the next few minutes required. Because that was what humans did. That was what they had always done. Not because they wanted to, but because they had learned a very long time ago that the universe did not care what you wanted. It only cared what you were willing to do. The silence on the bridge of the Ascendant Will had weight. It pressed down on the officers at their stations, and it filled the spaces between the softly glowing consoles, and it hung in the air like smoke from a fire that no one could see, but everyone could feel. Thisarek stood at the center of it all, and his crest was cycling through colors so slowly that it almost seemed like it was breathing. Pale dread shifting to crimson pride, shifting to the hard orange of anger, and then draining back to pale again, in an endless loop that told everyone on the bridge exactly how fractured their commander's certainty had become. He was looking at the tactical display. 12 red icons arranged in that strange, unclassifiable formation, surrounded by the vast blue constellation of his own fleet, 1,200 to 12. And somehow the 12 red icons were the ones that filled the room with dread. Lithara stood behind him and said nothing. "Say that the numbers had not already said. Open a private channel," Thisarek said at last, "to the Leviathan, encrypted, commander to commander." The channel opened, and Admiral Okafor's face appeared on Thisarek's personal screen, away from the eyes of the bridge crew. For a long moment, the two commanders simply looked at each other. The reptilian warlord with the shifting bioluminescent crest, and the quiet human with the steady dark eyes, separated by a gulf of culture and biology and 10,000 years of very different history. "Admiral," Thisarek said, and his voice was lower now, stripped of the formal authority he used for public addresses. This was one soldier speaking to another. "I want to understand something." "Ask," Okafor said. "Why are you here?" Okafor tilted his head slightly. "I told you, the Rim colonies are under our protection." "No," Thisarek said. "I heard what you told me. Now I am asking you why. The Rim colonies are weak. They have no significant resources, no strategic value, no military capability worth mentioning. They cannot pay you, and they cannot help you. So why would the Terran Federation commit a patrol group to their defense? Why would you put 12 ships and their crews in the path of an armada that outnumbers you 100 to 1? Okafor was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than before. "Because they asked us to." Thisarek waited for the rest of the answer, but Okafor simply looked at him as if those 6 words contained everything that needed to be said. "That is not a strategic reason," Thisarek said. "No," Okafor agreed, "it is not." "Then explain it to me, because I have commanded fleets for 4 decades, and I have never once committed forces to an engagement without a strategic reason." Okafor leaned back in his chair and folded his hands and looked at Thisarek with an expression that was neither aggressive nor defensive, but simply open, the face of a man who had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. "Commander," Humanity spent most of its history alone. We grew up on a small world, at the edge of an empty arm of the galaxy, and for a very long time, we believed we were the only intelligent life in the universe. When we finally reached the stars, and discovered that we were not alone, we also discovered that the galaxy was not a kind place. He paused. We learned very quickly that the powerful took what they wanted from the weak, and that no one intervened, because intervention had no profit in it. We watched species be conquered and absorbed and erased, and we recognized the pattern because we had seen it before on our own world, 1,000 times over, across every continent and every century of our history. And so you decided to intervene, Thiseric said. We decided that we would be the ones who showed up, Okafor said, not because it was profitable, not because it was strategic, but because we remembered what it felt like to be small and afraid and alone. We remembered what it felt like to cry out for help and hear nothing but silence. And we decided that no one within our reach would ever have to feel that way again, if we could prevent it. Thiseric looked at the human admiral, and for the first time in the conversation, he did not see an enemy, or a primitive, or a curiosity. He saw a commander who had brought 12 ships against 1,200, with full knowledge of what that meant, and who had done it anyway, because somewhere in the dark, a small voice had called for help. You would die for them, Thiseric said, and it was not quite a question. Every person on these 12 ships volunteered for this patrol, knowing exactly what they might face, Okafor said. Yes, Commander, we would die for them, not happily, not eagerly, but willingly, because some things matter more than survival. Eyes. Behind those closed eyes, he saw his fleet, 1,200 beautiful gleaming warships crewed by officers who had been told their entire lives that the Concordance was the highest expression of civilization the galaxy had ever produced, that their power was proof of their right to rule, that order and obedience were the foundations of a just universe. And against that, he saw 12 ugly, scarred ships full of humans who did not care about order or obedience or the right to rule, who cared about one thing and one thing only, that someone had asked for help. He opened his eyes. All vessels, he said, and his voice carried across the fleet-wide channel with a calm that surprised even himself. This is Fleet Commander Thiseric. All stop. I repeat, all stop, hold position, and await further orders. The effect was immediate and absolute. 1,200 warships cut their engines simultaneously, and the great shining river of the Fourth Grand Armada came to a dead halt in the void. Not a retreat, Thiseric told himself. A retreat would be an admission of defeat, and he had not been defeated. A halt. A pause. A recognition that the universe had just become more complicated than the Concordance had prepared him for. He turned to his communications officer. Transmit the following to Concordance High Command. Priority absolute. Reclassification request. Species designation human. Current classification Class 7 pre-ascendant. He paused, and then spoke the words that would send tremors through every corridor of power in the Concordance for decades to come. Reclassify to Class 1 strategic threat. Append notation. Do not engage. The officer stared at him for a moment, and then transmitted the message without a word. Thiseric turned back to the viewport, and looked at the 12 human ships that still hung in the darkness, exactly where they had been since the beginning. Moved. They had not powered up their weapons, or shifted into an attack posture, or done anything at all that suggested they had ever expected the Armada to actually fight them. They had simply shown up and said no. And that, Thiseric realized with a clarity that felt almost like pain, was the most terrifying thing of all. Not their weapons, not their armor, not their willingness to die. Their certainty. They had been certain from the very beginning. Certain that they were right to be here, certain that what they were doing mattered, certain in a way that had nothing to do with firepower or numbers, and everything to do with something deeper and older and more powerful than any weapon ever built. Fisarek gave the order, and the armada began its slow, silent turn. On the bridge behind him, Lithara watched the human ships on her display, as the distance between the two fleets grew wider with every passing second. The Erebus was still there at the edge of the formation, still motionless, still dark, its scarred hull catching none of the distant starlight, a shadow among shadows. She thought about what she had read in the human histories, about the wars they had fought, and the weapons they had built, and the terrible, beautiful, stubborn refusal to break that ran through their species like iron through stone. She thought about 12 ships facing 1,200. She thought about a small blue world on the edge of nothing. And as the armada entered hyperstream, and the stars stretched into lines of light, and the human ships finally disappeared from her screen, Lithara let out a breath she did not know she had been holding, and whispered words that no one else on the bridge could hear. We have ruled this galaxy for 10,000 years, because no one could challenge us, and now from a small blue world on the edge of nothing, something has arrived that does not care about our empire, or our history. Numbers. They care only that someone somewhere asked for help. She watched the last fading echo of the Erebus vanish from her sensors. And they are never ever going to stop coming. The screen went dark. The armada flew on. And behind them, in the silence of the Helix Nebula, 12 human warships sat in the void like sentinels, carved from iron and shadow, watching the stars with patient and unblinking eyes. Waiting, as they always did, as they always would, for the next small voice in the dark that called out for someone, anyone, to please come and help. Because that was the truth that the Concordance had never understood, and that humanity had carried in its bones since the very first time one human had reached out a hand to pull another from the mud. The measure of a species was not how much power it could gather. It was what it chose to do with that power when the ones who needed it had nothing to offer in return.